Good afternoon, everybody. It's the 30th of April, and we're taping again at St. Ambrose Church in Cecilia. I've moved into the first section of the memoir that I'm calling The Right Place, the Right Time, Memoir of a Kentucky Priest. And as I mentioned yesterday, there is an overview of the whole project. Then there's an introduction, which actually covers some of the same ground as the overview. It lays out the 10 time periods that I want to write about. And then this first of those time periods, 1633 to 1947, basically everything before my birth, back to the time when Catholics first came in significant numbers to the United States. We talked about that a good bit yesterday in the first part of the 1633 to 47, and I mentioned that once I got into it, what I thought would have been maybe about 40 pages ends up being, well, it's on the way to probably 200, since I'm up at about 90 and I've gotten just to the Civil War. And that's not until part 5 of this 1633 to 1947. Anyway, we'll see where that goes, but just to recap a little bit from yesterday, we've always taught that the Catholics came from Maryland for a number of reasons, one of which was the oppression that they were experiencing there. And another thing was the devastation caused to farms and families during the Revolutionary War. One of the things I touched on too, though, was the contributions of the residents of St. Mary's County to the American Revolution, and I'm glad we got to cover some of that yesterday. We moved along, of course, then to that migration and the background of that, some of the thought that the Maryland Catholics had about where they would go in the West, some other possibilities, including Missouri and so on. Well, they settled on central Kentucky, and we highlighted the migration of something called the League of 60 families, and highlighted 3 particular waves: 1785, 86, 87, named some of the families that were there in those groups and where they settled. Of course, that flood of people coming pretty much over the mountains of Maryland and down to Pittsburgh and into the river and on down the river continues on. And we're going to see some of the counties that folks settle into, how they begin to get around the falls of the Ohio at Louisville. And then later on, we'll talk about some other aspects of the migration of Catholics and others directly from Europe to Louisville. But we're in part 2 now, and this is going to be staying with pretty much that Catholic group that settles in and around Bardstown chiefly, and then we'll move on more specifically into the leadership there and how the diocese gets established. So, The Right Place at the Right Time, Memoir of a Kentucky Priest, 1633 to 1947, Part 2. Enjoying a cup of coffee with a nice cup that highlights Kentucky and Louisville, my hometown, a gift from Karen Wright and mother. We should consider some of these other locations and some of the personalities associated with them. That's the connecting sentence from the end of the last portion. We talked about those 3 significant places: Cartwright's Creek, Hardin's Creek, and Poplar Neck. So we're going to look at some of the other locations and some of the other personalities associated with them. We've seen that exploration of the Mississippi River by the Jesuit Marquette in the 17th century led to early settlement at places like Cahokia in 1699, Prairie de Rocher in 1722, and Vincennes on the Wabash River in 1732. As their colleagues in Maryland had established a church in memory of St. Ignatius, these missionaries named their first church in Indiana after his companion and co-founder, St. Francis Xavier. A French-Canadian, Father Pierre Gibault, served this northwestern territory heroically as a missionary and was of great benefit to the military commanders there, as well as at the fort on Corn Island. Born on the island of Martinique, Father Jean Rivet served with Gibault and is remembered as Indiana's first public school teacher. By the end of the century, they were joined on the frontier by two French priests, Gabriel Richard, who is today recognized as the founder of the University of Michigan, and a slightly younger man, ordained just 5 years, Benedict Joseph Flaget. Other early communities along the rivers would include those of Cincinnati, Gallipolis, Chillicothe, and Dayton on the Ohio and Miami rivers. When that first large group in Kentucky, led by Basil Hayden, settled on Pottinger's Creek, they did not attach the lasting name to the settlement. That honor would come to William de Rowan, who would also be the second priest to serve in Kentucky. Like Father Wayland before him, he was of Irish parentage, but had lived in France for a time. As would be the case for many another priest of those years of revolution and persecution in France, de Rohan fled to America, serving Catholics first in Virginia, then in Tennessee. He arrived at Pottinger's Creek in the autumn of 1790, a few months after Father Wayland had left. He is credited with building the first church in Kentucky, and at the summit of what is still called Rowan's Knob, he erected a large cross. Thus the church received its name. Father de Rohan lived a long life, but his ministry after those early years was severely hampered by alcoholism. When John Carroll sent the League of 60 on their way from Maryland with his blessing, he had promised to send them priests. On the 25th of May of 1793, he ordained the first man to become a priest in America, Stephen Theodore Baden, and promptly sent him to Kentucky. There he would earn the title of Apostle of the Midwest, serving nearly 60 years and exercising enormous influence in Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio. Like others of his countrymen, he would not be so enamored of the democratic approach to authority as were the English priests, and he would espouse a severe spirituality influenced by the movement known as Jansenism. In his An American Holy Land, Reverend Clyde Cruz, the 20th century's version of Benedict Webb, introduces Father Baden with these words, quote, "A man who was destined to be respected by most, but loved by very few," unquote. By the way, we traditionally anglicize the pronunciation of this priest's name, Baden, but in French, it would typically be said Baden. In Baltimore, young Stephen Baden met a somewhat older priest named Michael Barriere, who was also missioned to the frontier by Bishop Carroll. The two priests walked to Pittsburgh and, as others had before them, came by flatboat down the river to Limestone. Barriere traveled on to the Bardstown area but within 4 months moved on to serve in the Louisiana Territory. For his part, Baden served in the Fayette-Scott County area for as much as a year and had the authority from Bishop Carroll for such transactions as the purchase of lands. After what would be the first, but by no means the last, of conflicting claims and legal disputes, Baden moved on to the area near Pottinger's Creek, establishing his residence at what he called St. Stephen's Farm. The capable but still young priest would be alone in his clerical ministry for at least 3 years. However, in the last 3 years of the century, 3 more priests came to Kentucky, bringing fervent, if short-lived, hope to the faithful on the frontier. Father Michael Fournier, another exile from France, enthusiastically accepted Baden's direction to establish residence and build a church among the settlers at Hardin's Creek of the Rolling Fork River, the 1786 group of the Maryland League. In addition to the construction projects, he made the rounds of the settlements at an exhausting pace. Riding the circuits, these men would travel through the night using techniques of natural navigation, such as detecting directions through the feel of moss growing on the north side of trees. Arriving at what they called a station, they would offer instruction, devotion, counsel, sacramental services through the day, typically maintaining fasts. Fournier suffered a fatal stroke before he reached the age of 50. A seminary classmate of Fournier, Anthony Salmon, arrived at St. Stephen's in late January of 1799 and began to serve the growing community of Bardstown. However, before the end of the year, he fell from a horse and was dead before the age of 40. Of him, Baden wrote to Carroll, quote, "He joined mildness and affability to masculine spirits," unquote. In that same year, there came a priest about whom Baden would not write such a warm report. This was John Thayer, a Harvard-educated New Englander who was a convert to Catholicism. His area of residence and ministry was in the Scott-Fayette County settlements, which might have seemed a potentially apt setting for his ministry. This was the area into which had come the above-mentioned Protestant migrations. The civil and intellectual communities such as Danville and Harrodsburg were well on their way. Transylvania University in Lexington had been established nearly 2 decades earlier. While what we would later call the ecumenical relationships between Protestants and Catholics were at least benign, or criticism confined to correspondence and pamphleteering at this stage, Father Thayer chose to make acerbic slurs, even calling Methodists fools in public speeches. His noble cause of abolition was weakened not only by his lack of tact, but also by the fact that he held slaves. Baden disciplined Thayer with an official suspension of public ministry. Happily, Thayer found a better fit when in 1801 he went to England and Ireland and ministered effectively until his death in 1815. Passing mention has been made of Bardstown, but it will of course have the highest of profiles in this historic review. While it would not become fully incorporated by the state legislature until 1838, it was established as early as 1788 as the seat of Virginia's Nelson County. Among the families settling in the north end of the town were two, the McGills and the Reynolds, who would produce future bishops, and the Rogers, from whom would come the architect of the first cathedral in the west. Among others were the Rapiers, Gwynns, Sanders, Drurys, Warrens, and the indomitable Mary McManus. With her 4 children, they became widowed and fatherless when Thomas McManus was killed in an Indian attack upriver from Cincinnati. Continuing the journey, Mary established a home for herself and the children east of Lexington, only to see it destroyed by fire. When they resettled near Cox's Creek above Bardstown, their neighbors slightly upstream had established the community of Fairfield. These included the Gardners and the Clarks, and 2 more remarkable women, Grace Newton Simpson and Catherine Spaulding. South of Bardstown, the Beech Fork River makes a very pronounced hook, and its banks are prolific with poplar trees whose residents include wild turkeys. This is the place where Edward Howard, the trailblazer, selected his 400 acres, which he named Poplar Neck. It proved to be a good location for many reasons, not the least of which was that those trees grow tall and straight, and because they are so resistant to insects, they make great building material. The Howards built a house in 1795, which is still in use today. They used it not only as a residence, but also the site to which the circuit riding priests and their flocks would come for their religious exercises. The church building, which would be constructed at Poplar Neck using brick kilned on the property as well as those logs, also remains today as the oldest church in the Midwest of America. As we shall see, this property will have still greater significance. By the turn of the 19th century, the revolution in France was in full force and fury, one element of which was the dramatic persecution of religious establishments. Convents, monasteries, churches were being destroyed and their inhabitants jailed, executed, or exiled. We've seen individuals who came to the ministry in central Kentucky, and there will be many more. However, in the autumn of 1805, a group of 20 monks, priests and brothers, landed in Louisville en route to a previously scouted site in the interior of the state. Father Urbain Gouillet, a Trappist, so called because his abbey was at La Trappe in France, was the spiritual son of the 5th century Italian Saint Benedict of Nursia. The order is also referred to as Cistercians of Strict Observance because the monastery established at Citeaux in 1098 was committed to the strict observance of Saint Benedict's rule for monastic living. Urban and his companions went first to a property near Holy Cross, but after a hard winter in which several monks died, they moved to a location on Casey Creek, some 36 miles to the south and east. St. Bernard Church had been established there in 1802. There they created their monastery and a farm in spite of some initial challenges. In the summer of 1807, they encountered over 800 snakes. Still, they supported themselves with shops and the production of clocks, watches, and silverware. But the next year, there was not only fire, but also a flood. And Father Urban moved what remained of the community to the French settlements near Cahokia in Illinois and Florissant in Missouri. After about 5 years, believing that things had improved in Europe, they returned to France in 1814. The enduring first settlement of Trappists in America would not happen until 1848. Some of the clerical emigres from France fled to neighboring Belgium, but they would find there not more than a slight reprieve. The confiscation of properties and public execution, the guillotine, of their residents, which would number as many as 40,000 over 50 years in France, happened in Belgium as well. There was a college in the city of Bornheim, which was run by an order of priests who were also in exile. These were English-speaking followers of St. Dominic. A Spaniard, Dominic de Guzman, had started his order of preachers in the 13th century, and his spiritual descendants had established worldwide missions, including many in South and Central America as well as Europe. Edward Fenwick, the son of a Maryland Catholic, was a student at the College of Bornheim, where he felt the calling to join the Dominicans as a priest. When the college was seized and its faculty imprisoned, Fenwick's American citizenship stood him in good stead as he was released, and with him his confreres, including Reverends Thomas Wilson, Raymond Tuit, and Robert Auger. To the great delight, no doubt, of Bishop John Carroll, this quartet escaped to Baltimore. At the same time, around the city of Medellin, a Flemish priest had been exercising his ministry in various clandestine settings for about 20 years. Educated at Enghien, Gale, and Louvain, Charles Neerix was one of 14 children born to a physician and his, quote, valiant wife. Not sure who called her valiant, but was sure an apt title, 14 children. Another son became a priest, and 3 daughters became nuns from this Neerix family of Belgium. Constantly on the run from warrants for his arrest, Neerix would minister typically through the night in hospitals and other places of confinement, like prisons. After celebrating a Mass about 2 a.m., he would bring sacramental consolation to wounded prisoners and others who were often awaiting execution. In November of 1803, he wrote to Bishop Carroll, and 11 months later he arrived in Baltimore. Then, on what must have been one of the happiest days of Father Stephen Badden's life, Charles Neerix arrived at St. Stephen's Farm on the 18th of July of 1805. Neerix, who was a big, strong man with seemingly robust health, Barton Spalding called him Herculean, and Cruz called him a fullback, would build 10 churches in 10 years. One of these was on Clear Creek in Hardin County, a station which Father Badden had visited on his circuit for the previous year or so. He celebrated Mass in the home of James French in a village named for another resident, William Cole. The Dominicans were eager to begin ministry in America, and Bishop Carroll was no less eager to have them do so. However, he first put them to work in the missions of the Chesapeake Bay. Edward Fenwick, in particular, was eager to move further west, especially since members of his family and friends had been among the League of 60. They were settled around the Cartwright's Creek area of what had by this time become Washington County. In the autumn of 1805, Fenwick came to see them and Father Badden, and with an inheritance, he purchased a property with a grist mill from a man named John Waller. Returning to Maryland, he finalized legalities and with Bishop Carroll and his colleagues from Belgium made a plan for the first Dominican mission in America. Later that year, Fathers Wilson and Tuitt arrived in Kentucky, Tuitt serving the growing congregations near Bardstown for a while, as Wilson moved on to Cartwright's Creek and the property which Fenwick had purchased. Earlier, a church named St. Anne had been established and was served by Fathers Fournier and Baden. A gentleman named Henry Boone of that congregation offered accommodations to Father Wilson, and he was soon joined there by Tuitt, then by Fenwick, and a seminary student named Dominic Young, and in 1807 by Father Angers. They named the first Dominican establishment in the United States St. Rose of Lima, for the Peruvian woman who was the first person born in the Western Hemisphere to become a saint. Within 2 years, while assisting with the circuit riding duties, these men began the ministry of education and built a residence and a worship space, which Dominicans call a priory. Though it has changed considerably over these 2 centuries, the sanctuary wherein Mass was celebrated this morning is the same space in which it was celebrated on Christmas morning of 1809. In January of 1990, I was on a month-long tour of Eastern India under the auspices of the Rotary International Foundation. Having been in Orissa State for most of the first 10 days of the trip, I had met very few Christians and no Roman Catholics until quite by chance I met a man who, on learning I was a priest, introduced himself as an alumnus of St. Xavier University in Calcutta. He then told me that he could introduce me to an ashram staffed by Jesuit priests and missionaries of charity, the order found by Mother Teresa. When I approached the door of the residence the next morning, an Indian priest, Father Gertzi, warmly welcomed me and shouted upstairs to his housemates, "Father Carl, Father Ed, please come and greet Father Ben from Kentucky." The voices of Father Carl from New York City and Father Ed from Philadelphia responded with laughter. One said, "You must be mistaken, Gertzi. Kentucky has no priests, only Baptists." Coming down the stairs, these veteran missionaries, whose careers in India combined for nearly a century of service, continued this jovial way of cutting through pleasantries and began to receive back some of what they were giving me. I challenged, "Father Carl, Father Ed, when did New York City and Philadelphia first have bishops?" Taking the bait, they responded accurately, "It was way back in 1808 when the Pope appointed bishops for us, for Boston, and for some obscure place out west." Providing their comeuppance, I said, that obscure place was Bardstown, Kentucky, where, yes, we have Baptists, but where we also have priests and have had them for over 200 years. During the first 3 decades that the faith-based settlement of the Midwestern wilderness detailed in these pages was happening, it did not go unnoticed in more populated areas, certainly in Baltimore, but even in Rome. In the less than 2 decades of nationhood, 1709, 1807, the Catholic population of the United States rose from 30,000 to 150,000. Bishop Carroll had informed the Pope of this, and as the civil leader of the Papal States, Pope Pius VI would have been aware that what had been 13 colonies were now 16 United States, with more to come. Not long before he died, the Pope had a Maryland priest, Leonard Neal, to serve as an auxiliary or assistant bishop in Baltimore. The successor to Pius VI would go considerably further. In a document entitled Ex Debito Pastoralis, translated roughly from Pastoral Concern, Pope Pius VII, on the 8th of April of 1808, gave Baltimore the status of an archdiocese and created dioceses in New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, and Bardstown. His consultations with Bishop Carroll surfaced the colonial cities as fairly obvious choices, but the frontier town maybe not so much. Actually, Baden and others were in consultation with the bishop in Baltimore, and locations such as Lexington, Danville, and Frankfort were considered. One might ask from today's perspective about the river cities of Cincinnati, Louisville, Vincennes, St. Louis. We have seen in the case of Louisville some problems they faced, and their development would only come later. However, the most salient recommendation of Bardstown came from the fact that it had the largest Catholic population, and the vigor of their faith was clearly evident. In the same sense that a civil county has a seat, so an ecclesiastical diocese, a jurisdiction, has a see city, where there is located a cathedral and a chair of authority. Along with his recommendation that Bardstown become the see city, Bishop Carroll was invited to propose the person who would occupy the seat, the bishop. About the names of Baden, Nearix, and Wilson, Father Cruz writes of their strengths and weaknesses. He gives details, too, of the conflicting approaches to ministry and spirituality which were embodied in the Jesuit influences on Baden and Nearix, and the more humanist elements from Thomas Aquinas, which Wilson, the scholarly Dominican, would have preached. This is, after all, a proofreading, and there is a glaring error. Not Jesuit influences, Jansenist influences. I mentioned that yesterday. Those differences had effects on the day-to-day lives of the frontier Catholics, and those influences can be tracked through the generations. Perhaps a compromise candidate, perhaps evidence of the prescience and wisdom of Carroll. Whatever the rationale, the name Benedict Joseph Flagey was at the top of the list of 4 for Bardstown, presented to the Pope. A similar process was involved in the selection for the other 3 see cities, New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Benedict Flagey came from the village of Pontonac, near the city of Bayonne, in the Auvergne region of south-central France. He was trained by and became a member of an organization called the Society of Saint Sulpice, also known as Sulpician Fathers. Taking their inspiration from a 7th century French bishop, these priests, using a major church in Paris as their headquarters, dedicated themselves to the spiritual formation of priests who would not opt for a monastic lifestyle and who would locate their ministry in the context of a parish community. We have seen that Flaget did this in Indiana, where he was followed by another Sulpician-trained Frenchman, Simon Gabriel Broutet. At the time of his appointment, which he received with considerable reluctance, Flaget was teaching, first at the Jesuit College in Georgetown, as well as at the seminary in Baltimore, to which Bishop Carroll had welcomed the Sulpicians. Having taken his objections all the way to the Pope himself, Flaget submitted to the direction of his superior in Paris, who sent him on his way back to America with a French cookbook and a set of sewing needles. He would need considerably more in the way of resources as he accepted the pastoral care of a flock scattered over an area 2.5 times the size of all of France. When he had arrived back in Baltimore in July of 1810, the new bishop was traveling with his friend Broutet and 5 seminary students, 3 of whom would serve with him in Kentucky, and 2 of whom would join the Jesuit community at Georgetown. In Baltimore, he was greeted not only by Archbishop Carroll, but also by Bishops John Cheverus of Boston and Michael Egan of Philadelphia. Bishop Luke Concannon, the Irish Dominican who had been appointed to New York, had died in Europe before taking up his residence in his see city. On the 4th of November of that year, Carroll, Cheverus, and Egan consecrated Flaget in the Church of St. Patrick at a place called Fells Point, not far from the seminary in Baltimore. With his seminarians, including Guy Chabrat, Antoine Didier, Peter Schaeffer, and Jacques Derigot, and a priest, Jean-Baptiste David, the Bishop of Bardstown and the Midwest began his trek across the mountains for the float down the river. At Pittsburgh, they were met by Edward Fenwick, who accompanied them as far as Louisville, which they reached on the 4th of June of 1811. Charles Nearich was the guide for the trip to Bardstown, where the group spent 2 days before proceeding to St. Stephen's Farm. In the chapel there, Father Baden and the assembled faithful welcomed the man who would be their chief shepherd until the middle of the century. This year marks the 50th anniversary, This year marks the 50th anniversary of my graduation from college. 51st now. I was writing this last year. This year marks the 51st anniversary of my graduation from college. For half of my undergraduate education and all of my high school curriculum, I was instructed by priests of the Society of Saint Sulpice, Flaget's group. The 8 years of elementary education took place in a huge parochial school under the direction of women who took their name from a British woman, St. Ursula, a contemporary of St. Patrick. This track was certainly not unusual for a Catholic student in Kentucky in the years after World War II, especially one who was part of a long, consistent genealogical line. On my father's side, I am in the 7th generation of an identified line of Catholics who started coming to Kentucky from Maryland well over 200 years ago. Browns, Peaks, Vessels, Jaegers, Mills, Edelins, Petersons, Nebbits, Smocks, Spaldings, Rheineys, and yes, Mattingleys are a part of who I am. Their story, one of faith and religious practice that motivated and gave order and meaning to their lives, is important to me. By being knowledgeable of their history, I can be knowledgeable of them. I can also have a better understanding of myself, how I interact with my world, and what I might prepare to pass on to others who will be here after I'm gone. Why it was that I became a priest and remained one, why it was that I became an effective career military officer in spite of being morally conflicted about much of the military's history. These and other questions have insight, if not answers, available to me in a detailed reflection such as this one on which I am embarked. Thus far, it has been the study of my father's very Catholic side of the family. I am equally my mother's son. Her lineage, with little connection to the Maryland migration and considerably less Catholic, contributes nonetheless to the very important elements of who I am personally and professionally. More of a mixed genealogy, my mother's lineage has some interesting combinations which I have explored. For example, her mother was raised in a Louisville household at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, which was both Protestant and Catholic. This was most unusual for the time and represented a real, if subtle, defiance. She would be part two of a migration to Kentucky, which happened 50 years after the one from Maryland. And coming from the interior of Europe, these people settled mostly in urban areas. Her husband, my maternal grandfather, was part of a migration which was largely, though perhaps not exclusively, Protestant, and which came from the colonies, especially Virginia. Having looked at some of the important events, locations, and personalities in the early history of Catholic Kentucky, we will now do the same, at least with the highlights of Protestant history, particularly those which have a bearing on my genealogy and other aspects of this memoir. The libraries of several major seminaries and universities in Kentucky would, of course, provide enormous resources for this history. However, for the overview which suits my purpose and those of the readers of these pages, John Bowles' Religion in Antebellum Kentucky and the Bicentennial Bookshelf series is most helpful as well as handy. We have seen that it was an Anglican service which was prayed under the enormous spread of, quote, the church tree on a Sunday in late May of 1775 at Harrodsburg. Reverend John Lythe was part of what was called the Transylvania Column. As revolutionary calls for independence developed into the war and the new nation, religious ties to England made it difficult for this faith group to flourish in the early days. However, by the 1790s, groups with names like the Episcopal Society began to prosper in the Lexington area, and a young college graduate from Virginia named James Moore offered them leadership. He was ordained in 1794. As Moore began to focus on the Ministry of Education with the Kentucky Academy and Transylvania University, Reverend Samuel Keene joined him to serve the congregations on a circuit which would include the villages of Georgetown, Paris, and Winchester. Originally a Methodist, Reverend William Kavanaugh accepted Episcopalian ordination on the 20th of June of 1800 and served in Lexington. He was followed by Reverend George Thomas Chapman, whose leadership of the parish in Lexington firmly established this group in the Commonwealth. The largest denomination in Kentucky has been and continues to be by far the Baptist Church. However, it is as difficult to make that statement as it is to trace its accuracy and history, because, as any good Baptist will say, there are so many different groups which answer to the title Baptist. As early as 1755, there are descriptions of evangelical Baptists, regular Baptists, separate Baptists, particular Baptists, and general Baptists in Virginia and the Carolinas. Reverend Lewis Craig, whose relative we have seen in other contexts, was minister of the Spotsylvania Baptist Church of Orange County, Virginia in 1770, and he was among the early visitors to Kentucky. Others who preached in those first years of settlement include Thomas Tinsley, William Hickman, Joseph Redding, John Taylor, and William Marshall. One of the images used in those sermons was no doubt that the people of Israel leaving Egypt for the promised land of Canaan. With Virginia land grants similar to those of their contemporaries, these pilgrims came together for Farewell Sunday in September of 1781. With assurance that God was leading them, this caravan of heavily laden wagons carrying an old Bible and 200 adult members, 500 to 600 overall, became the traveling church. Through what must have seemed an interminable autumn, this group came overland through dust, which challenged breathing, rain, which made for slow travel and discomforts of various kinds, and cold, which certainly brought illness. Nonetheless, their prayers, preaching, and hymn singing sustained them as they moved over the Blue Ridge and through the Cumberland Gap until on the second day of December they reached Gilbert's Creek in present-day Garrett County, their temporary settlement. A stockade, cabins, and a sturdy church, all with loopholes for guns, were quickly completed. They learned, though, of still greener pastures, and they relocated on the Elkhorn Creek of the Kentucky River near Lexington. The Elkhorn Baptist Association would join those of the Cedar Creek near Bardstown and the Severns Valley near Elizabethtown as the first organizations of Baptists in the state. The Virginian David Rice has already been mentioned here as the founder of the Presbyterian Church in Kentucky, another of those who were unusual among the pioneers in that he came west with a university degree. Rice had studied at Princeton, or as it was then known, Nassau Hall. Arriving at Danville in October of 1783, he developed three congregations in his first year. Concord and Cane Run were two congregations on the Dix River, and New Providence on the Salt River. He formed a school in his home and developed a solid reputation for his character. Fully 75 years before this would become common among Roman Catholic clergy, David Rice would be given the title Father. Bowles calls him, quote, clearly the outstanding religious leader of early Kentucky. On the 1st of February of 1785, Father Rice was elected chairman of the board of the Episcopalian Transylvania Seminary. Another indicator of his prestige was his membership in the Danville Convention, which framed Kentucky's first constitution. He argued there for the gradual abolition of slavery in the state, and even though he was unsuccessful, it is no less remarkable that this first blow against the institution of slavery west of the Appalachians was struck by this popular, even revered Presbyterian clergy. Just as the Anglican ties to Mother England made it difficult for them in America in the early years of independence, so it was for the Methodists. Their founder, after all, was the Tory John Wesley. However, Wesley, in his 80s, realized after the war that American Methodism needed independence too. At his direction, Francis Asbury convened what was called the Christmas Conference in December of 1784. This was at a place already familiar with organized religion, Baltimore in Maryland. Asbury would lead the group for 30 years. It was he who, in 1783, had already sent missionaries to Kentucky, including Francis Clark, John Durham, William Thompson, and Thomas Stevenson. In 1786, these pastors were joined by James Haw and Benjamin Ogden in riding their circuits. Asbury seems to have been a bit frustrated, however, when he made his first visit to Kentucky in 1790. He wrote in his diary, quote, "The Methodists do little here. Others lead the way," unquote. Maybe Asbury's disappointment is attributable to the basic challenge of moving from a developed area in the colonies to what was still a wilderness. For all our enthusiasm about these early religious establishments, we should reflect a bit on how they experienced piety and devotion. Maybe Asbury was looking for churches as in buildings. There would not have been many of them to be seen in the early years, especially of any lasting structural or architectural beauty. The dynamic of circuit-riding clergy was in the idea that it was easier for the clergy to take services to the faithful than for the faithful to bring themselves to services. Likely the most common experience of these pioneers, faithful as they may have been, was fatigue. In those early years, they must have worked all the time. All the activities whose management we take for granted. Protection from the heat and cold, clothing, nourishment, hydration, darkness, illness, transportation, housing, etc., were enormous and constant tasks for our ancestors. Making time in the midst of these necessities to stop and go to church was surely too much of a luxury to be a priority. It is impossible to estimate the percentage of the population who practiced religion publicly in 1800. But scholars like Cruz and Bowles reckon it liberally at about 10%, who would even identify strongly with the denomination. Bowles writes, quote, "Though Kentucky's population and commerce boomed, religion appeared moribund," unquote. From our perspective, it is clear that the forces of irreligion, such as preoccupation or even apathy, would not be as powerful as they may have seemed at the time, and perhaps the basis of faith was more firm than they might have assumed. Still, it would seem there was a need for a deus ex machina, a catalyst to put the fear of God into people. That seems to have come from a specific place in Kentucky called the New Madrid Fault. It was this geologic feature far beneath the Mississippi River, eastern Missouri and western Kentucky, which became the epicenter of a series of earthquakes and aftershocks in 1811 and 12, the enormity of which few have been experienced in North America in the 2 centuries since. Massive earthquakes in modern times include San Francisco, 18th of April, 1906, Long Beach, 10th of March, 1933, Anchorage, 27th of March of 1964, Oakland, 17th of October of 1989, and Los Angeles, the 17th of January of 1994. New Madrid is categorized with them. Today, these seismic events seem to have their severity measured in loss of life and property, as well as the more empirical measures available with the magnitude scale developed by Charles Richter, who died in 1985. Of course, in 1811 and 12, the population of the area around the New Madrid Fault would be considered sparse and its location remote by today's standards. Still, there are drawings and journal reports which give reliable data and descriptions. 4 major quakes and nearly 200 moderate to large aftershocks are known to have occurred between the 16th of December of 1811 and the 15th of March of 1812. Immediate and permanent effects included permanently sunken land masses, riverbank failures, and landslides. Huge waves were experienced in the rivers, swamping shorelines and eliminating islands. For a time, the flow of the mighty Mississippi itself was reversed. Destructive havoc was wreaked on houses and other buildings, as well as boats, from St. Louis in Missouri to Natchez in Mississippi, from Cairo in Illinois to Cincinnati in Ohio. Shaking walls were reported as far east as Washington, D.C. and Charleston in South Carolina. Shaking of the spiritual kind was happening in a moderate way in the first decade of the 19th century. This was the beginning of the Second Great Revival, and it was happening in Kentucky. An earlier revival expressed in writing like Jonathan Edwards' "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God" had taken place in New England in the previous century. It was then, too, that Mother Ann Lee brought the movement known as the Shakers to America. They would be one element of this Second Great Revival as they established 2 communities in Kentucky at Logan County and Mercer County in the first quarter of the 19th century. And while their communities would die out within a century, the response, or more accurately, the reaction to them, would create renewed approaches to faith in Christ, which would grow in strength and continue today. After Father David Rice, the Presbyterian, had come to Kentucky from Virginia, another minister of his tradition followed. This was James McGrady, who had been born of Scots-Irish parents in Pennsylvania but was raised in North Carolina. He studied preaching in Virginia and developed a dramatic oratorical style. A man of commanding size, powerful voice, piercing eyes, and guilt-provoking words, he challenged all classes of people with, quote, fire and brimstone, unquote. As he invaded the easy consciences of landowners and planters of Virginia and North Carolina, he met some opposition. However, among their white indentured workers, he was a hit. They also told him of their relatives who had moved on to Kentucky. McGrady was especially motivated as he learned of 3 groups known collectively as Rogues Harbor. These were on the Red, the Muddy, and the Gasper Rivers in Logan County, Kentucky. In his first years, he preached tirelessly, but with less than spectacular results. Then the earth moved, and so did the Spirit. At one service, several hundred of the 3 communities came together for an outdoor service. It was June. McGrady was assisted by 2 colleagues, Reverends William Hodge and John Rain. 2 others, John McGee and his brother William, en route to Ohio, stopped and joined in the service. At one point, a woman started shouting and singing in a foreign language, then stopped as suddenly as she had started. John McGee, who had experience in stoking the fires of religious emotion and zeal, announced that the Holy Spirit was present again as the New Testament had described that presence in Jerusalem. Dozens in the congregation fell into a death-like trance, overcome with their convictions of sin and their belief in its wages. This is referenced in Romans chapter 6, verse 23. News spread quickly of this extraordinary event, and McCready and others proceeded to schedule more services of this kind. People loaded wagons and traveled considerable distances to attend revivals, which would last several days at a time. The largest seems to have been at Cane Ridge, mentioned earlier as one of Father Rice's meeting places. He had been succeeded there by Barton W. Stone, a fellow Presbyterian from Maryland. Stone had also experienced the apathetic response to religion, so he considered the success of the revival movement good news indeed. Since he was located closer to the growing population centers of the state, he did a lot of evangelizing and promoting. The result was a crowd which is said to have numbered no less than 12 and perhaps as many as 20,000 men, women, and children. In time, Barton Stone became convinced that such an ecstatic approach to religion and worship was not sustainable. He was also troubled by the splintering, due surely to rivalry among the groups and their leaders. These included, in a second generation, Reverends Robert Marshall and John Thompson, and some newcomers to this fertile ground of the Commonwealth: Richard McNamara, Rice Haggard, Matthew Houston, and John Dunleavy. A pamphlet authored by Haggard entitled An Address to the Different Religious Societies on the Sacred Import of the Christian Name served as a discussion starter and, in a sense, a finisher. For Barton Stone, who was joined in his side of the discussion and conviction by Thomas Campbell and his son Alexander, the issue was simply Christ and one's faith in him. One result of the Second Great Awakening was the birth throughout Kentucky of the Disciples of Christ, or Christian Church. McCready and others would move on to still other pastures, but leave behind the Transylvania Presbytery, the Springfield Presbytery, and the Cumberland Presbytery, which would see perhaps the first ordination of a woman in America. Their growth, the result of God touching souls, or the new man with fault, or perhaps a bit of both, would make them, with Methodists and Baptists to this day, the most prominent denomination in Kentucky. The paternal side of my mother's family lived in Kentucky through the revivals of the Second Great Awakening. David William Bond, my grandfather, was the grandson of Lucy Jane McCoy. Her grandmother was Elizabeth Rice, who was born in Virginia, one generation removed from Father David Rice. Actually, they overlapped, though he was 37 years older and died in Kentucky. and as far as we know, she remained in Virginia. Grandpa Dave Bond was the great-great-grandson of William Bond, a Virginia soldier in the Revolutionary War, who was born in Hanover County 7 years after David Rice was. I'll bet they knew each other. Other names in Grandpa Bond's chart include Watson, Bogus, Cranston, Holman, Crutchfield, Collins, Becker, Walker, Consalvin, Taylor, Cartley, Bennett, Benton, Dodson, and Cox. Several were from Pennsylvania and North Carolina, as well as Virginia. There are also some Johnsons and a Birch, which we have seen among the Maryland Catholics. Another which appears prominent among those who stayed in Maryland is Bailey. A plausible theory about the mixture of Maryland Catholics with the Virginia Protestants is that it seems to have happened in the center of the state, south of Frankfort, the capital, where the Bonds became especially prominent. If it did, the Johnsons and Birches were likely people who had ceased to identify as Catholic. The other common denominator, which those Bonds of Mercer and Franklin counties will share with their Catholic neighbors a little to the west in Nelson and Marion counties, will be, you guessed it, bourbon. Getting back to the Catholics and somewhat back to bourbon, we last saw them in this narrative as they welcomed their bishop to a place called St. Stephen's Farm, which, while it has not been called that for about 200 years now, is located walking distance from another establishment which has also experienced some name changes, Maker's Mark Distillery. The scene, though, on the 11th of June of 1811 must have been truly remarkable. Webb has this eyewitness account from Badden's journal. The bishop there found the faithful kneeling on the grass and singing canticles in English. The country women were nearly all dressed in white, and many of them were still fasting, though it was then 4 o'clock in the evening, they having entertained a hope to be able to assist at his Mass and to receive the Holy Communion from his hands. The altar had been prepared under a bower composed of 4 small trees which overshadowed it with their foliage. Here the bishop put on his pontifical robes. He was conducted to the chapel in procession, and the whole function closed with the prayers and ceremonies prescribed for the occasion in the Roman Pontificale. Even after that congregation dispersed, Father Badden's cabin must have been crowded as Flagey and his traveling companions remained at St. Stephen's. These strong young men would have certainly earned their keep as they labored into the summer on the many needs of the community, giving assistance to the priests on the circuit and continuing their own education toward priesthood. Still, Flagey knew that this could not become the center of the new diocese. Located less than 10 miles up Pottinger's Creek from Holy Cross, it was a further 10 miles to Bardstown, just above Poplar Neck. At Howard Station, Thomas and Anne, who had no children, were living alone on the farm with its considerable acreage. Edward's other sons had moved on west. In what would be the largest bequest in these early years, Flagey accepted ownership of the property, which he named in honor of the donor, St. Thomas. By November, the bishop and his companions had built a new residence for the Howards and moved into the big house on what Flagey called the plantation. It is difficult to be exact today about the dates for some of these historic buildings. Spalding and Webb don't always give details. Cruz, with access to Flaget's diaries, still has to use phrases like built apparently in 1812. I own an original copy of a book about St. Thomas, which was published by Reverend William Howlett in 1906. Father Howlett had been a student at the seminary at St. Thomas before the Civil War. I received his book as a gift when I became pastor there in 1982. As I was intently reading Howlett's description of the ancient place in which I was now serving, I jumped up and went to find Glenn Metcalf, the man whom I had hired for maintenance and custodial work, and with whom I am friends to this day. Waving him off the mowing machine, he gave me an understandably perplexed look as I asked him to go and measure the interior dimensions of the old log cabin. In a few minutes, he said, "Don't know why you need to know that, but it's 20 by 32 feet. Those are the exact numbers which Father Howlett had. He also tells us that the building served as a residence to the bishop, priests, and seminarians, as well as their place of study and prayer, to which the local community continued to be welcome. Howlett and others in their reflective style drew the stark contrast between this, quote, palace and those of bishops and priests of contemporary Europe and Canada, as they described the hand-hewn logs and the mud and straw mortar that chinked them, the rough planks which served as libraries, etc. It is, of course, easy for me with hindsight to consider the etymology of the word seminary. This place was a seed. Cruz writes of Flaget's top 3 priorities as he arrived in Kentucky: a cathedral, a seminary, and a convent of women. The latter 2 of them would be established at St. Thomas, Poplar Neck, and the first 3 miles to the north in Bardstown. In reality, Flaget would have within 12 years not 1 but 3 convents, not 1 but 2 seminaries with 2 other colleges, and that cathedral which would see the ordination of another bishop and the creation of another diocese. I have often found that one of the most enriching elements of the Roman Catholic tradition is at the same time one of the most difficult to explain, whether to people who are unfamiliar with Catholicism or to lifelong Catholics, and that is the concept and institution of religious orders, particularly of men. Thus far in this study, we have encountered Jesuits, Sulpicians, Cistercians, and Dominicans. There are many others, and there are branches of some of them. There's a joking answer to the joking question: what is the only thing that God does not know? Answer: how many types of Franciscans there are. I have many times been asked, "Father, to what religious order do you belong?" When I reply that I don't belong to one, I get a confused look. That look does not seem to clear up when I try to explain that priests whose ministry may appear to be, and in practicality is the same, may have different types of training and some very different practices. I have served, for example, as a chaplain with priests of all 5 of the orders mentioned here. We did the same work in the same setting. However, each of their backgrounds was different from each other's as well as from mine. Jesuits, known for foreign missions and educational institutions. Sulpicians, known for seminary education. Cistercians, known for contemplative monastic living. Dominicans, known for education and spiritual retreat ministry. Franciscans, known for God knows what. I served as a military chaplain with men of all these orders. In addition, they all had some experience of parish ministry, which is my specialty. The distinction in terminology used most often is, for me, diocesan priest, attached to a diocese. And for my colleagues, order priests, attached to an order. Another distinction often heard is secular priests, which I am, and regular priests, the orders. Latin roots are helpful here. Regula, following a rule, and secularis, non-religious. So when the Franciscan or Dominican is called religious, and I am not, I thumb my nose and I say, what am I, chopped liver? I told you this would get complicated. Most, though not all, of the members of the religious orders take a vow of poverty. It is actually a vow of common ownership. Secular priests do not. I manage my own finances, pay bills, own stock or property if I can afford to, pay taxes because I have to. Order priests, because of common ownership, do not have personal finances. At lunch, once with a group of Marines, one of them had invited his priest cousin who wanted to talk to me about the chaplaincy. This man was a Franciscan. When the group asked us to talk about how we were different, I said to Father Bob, I'll show them my credit card if you'll show them yours. He grinned knowingly and said, sure. His was imprinted, Treasurer Franciscan Fathers. Mine, of course, read Benedict J. Brown. I next made a wisecrack that I knew he had heard from other diocesan priests. You may take a vow of poverty, but I keep it. Having gone this far in a diversion, I will go a little farther so as to include a good joke. It seems that at the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, there were, besides 3 wise men, 3 priests, a Franciscan, a Dominican, and a Jesuit. The Franciscan, with a pious smile, said, this is just beautiful. For the Savior of the world to be born in the midst of abject poverty is so fitting. St. Francis, who himself will build a crib scene, will also teach in the 12th century that the church should have a preferential option for the poor, as Jesus himself did. The Dominican, with a smirk of one-upmanship, said, my good friend, that is a lovely sentiment. But in your naivete, you are missing the point entirely. The centerpiece of this scene is clearly the Blessed Mother. As St. Dominic will point out in the 13th century, her faith is the essential element in the mystery of the Incarnation. She is the mediatrix of all grace. In the meantime, the Jesuit had moved over to get the ear of Joseph, to whom he said in a low, masculine voice, listen, bud, if your boy develops a jump shot and can rebound, we can probably get him a scholarship to Gonzaga. The joke teller can use the Jesuit college of his or her choice. This digression, extravagant as it is, serves a larger purpose in this narrative than merely setting up a joke. It provides valuable background for major and minor elements of the story of Catholicism in Kentucky, America, and the world, as we have seen and will continue to see. For example, there were subtle dynamics at play in the selection of the bishop of the new diocese of Bardstown in 1808. We have suggested, and history has proven, the worthiness of the appointment of Benedict Flanchet. However, the fact that a Dominican, Luke Concannon, was nominated for the Diocese of New York likely hurt the candidacy of the Dominican Samuel Wilson in Kentucky. In later portions of this memoir, this type of ecclesiastical analysis will take on the flavor of what in the sports world is called handicapping. But let's return to those Dominicans and the wonderful work they are doing from their brand new priory at St. Rose. Webb suggests that this first establishment of its kind in America was given a boost in much the same way that the new diocese had been, through a bequest, in this case from the family of the late Bishop-elect Concannon. Father Angers and Fenwick were serving parishes, particularly in the Bluegrass region at White Sulphur, near Frankfort, and in Lexington in northern Kentucky. Fathers Tuitt and Wilson were serving the missions at places like Fairfield as well as St. Rose. They were also developing a college which they named for their preeminent scholar and patron of theologians, the 13th century Italian St. Thomas Aquinas. One of their students was Jefferson Davis, the future President of the Confederate States of America, who was born at Fairview in southern Kentucky, some 7 months before Abraham Lincoln, the future President of the United States, was born at Knob Creek in central Kentucky. In a true irony of history, these two men, most prominent when the nation was most divided, spent their formative years a few apart in Washington County, Kentucky. For his part, Bishop Flaget would have the joy of ordaining his first priest at St. Rose, when on Christmas Day of 1811, he conferred holy orders on his fellow French Sulpician, Guy Ignatius Chevron. So, you have endured part 2 of 1633 to 1947. And as you will likely know, we'll see much more of that development of Catholicism on the frontier, and also a good bit more of the Protestant developments too. But my voice is about gone, and Karen has been very patient again. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, you've got the great advantage, listeners, that you can turn Ben Brown off whenever you want to. God bless.